Going to talk a little bit about sin. This is not a how-to. They surveyed Americans and they asked them what they believe in as far as sin is concerned. Do you believe that there's a such thing as sin? Do you have a belief in sin? And they came up with 87% of Americans believe there is a such thing as sin. It's a pretty good high number. You figure this is not Christians. Now, Christians were probably, if you asked them, would be more like 90 or 91. That might be funny later. Y'all are a tough crowd, I tell you what. One of the questions, or one of the ways they define sin, was that something that's almost always considered wrong. Something that is almost always considered wrong. And 87% of Americans say that they believe that there's a such thing as sin, which is something that is almost always considered wrong. So you ready to play a game?
Yes. Do it.
All right. I'll let you guess the percentages of Americans who believe the following things are sin. Adultery.
Yes.
Percentage. I need a percentage. 72. Well, the number couldn't be any higher than 87% because that's the only number of people that believe in sin. But fortunately, this is the one thing that everybody universally believes is a sin. 87%. If you believe in sin, you believe adultery is a sin. How about gossip? 65%, 10. 47%. Now I know where the other 53% of you fall. How about not taking care of our bodies? Not being good stewards of our bodies? Cheater, pumpkin eater back there. 35%. Now, here's the thing I found interesting, because they also asked, is it a sin to be significantly overweight? I would say that falls under not taking care of our body, but I would also say, now what exactly are we talking about significant? Because it has to be more overweight than I am. And I'm pretty sure everybody else would say the same thing, right? It was about 17%. 17%. How about racism? 65? 74%. Sex before marriage. This wasn't a yes or no. 45%. This one's a really important issue. Dancing. I suppose if you can't dance, it should be 100%, right? Only 4%. Dancing was one of those that in the olden days, way before my time, was a really big deal. But in the Church of the Nazarene went through it anyway. I'll kind of move that. One of the things that I wanted to point out with this was that there's no universal concept of sin. Within the church even, if we say, oh, someone is caught up in sin, or we have a different opinion of exactly what that means, because when you stop and you think about it, you have this idea of 87% saying sin is a real thing, something that is almost always wrong. And then you have a different opinion of what exactly would constitute a sin. There's one that I gave you that I'm pretty sure is not a sin, and that would be dancing. But it depends on what kind of dancing we're talking about. So you would think that if we could agree that there is a such thing as sin, we would at least be able to point to there are certain things which are sin. But we can't. When you think about what's going on in your own mind, your thinking, when someone says to you, what certainly would be a sin? There are probably some things that come to mind. There are probably some things that you would say, this is always a sin, this is always incorrect, this is always something we ought not do. And then I want you to think about the fact that not everybody's list is going to be the same. Kind of a struggle, isn't it? And then what for you is or maybe is not a gray area. Some might say like dancing falls under the gray area where sometimes it's okay and sometimes it's not. There's times when it's maybe acceptable and there's times when, well, you've gone too far. I think part of the problem that we run into, just to tell you the truth, is that we would love to go to the Bible, to the book of whatever, open it up and see a list of sins. Be able to say, look, here's exactly, and then, some little asterisks. If it's sort of a gray area like dancing, here's when it's wrong, here's when it's right. Right? Thought about this a lot, and I think one of our problems, and I've been thinking of this for a long while, is that we are kind of weak on our teaching about sin. Not that I want to get up here and we can bring the pulpit up and I can beat it or something and say, if you're involved in certain things, you're going to hell, and that's all there is to it. But I think we tell people, you should stop sinning, and we're a good holiness church, which believes that Jesus Christ died so that you don't have to keep sinning. But do we really talk about what our concept of sin is? What it means to be sin, or to have sin in your life? The question for us this morning is, what is the biggest danger in our doctrine of sin? If you were to stop and think, this is what sin is, what's the biggest danger in our doctrine of sin? Now don't worry, I'm only going to spend the next 3 hours going into a really in-depth discussion on our doctrine of... I used that joke last week, I can't do it twice. We do have an article of faith, it's number 5. You've got it memorized, right? We believe in, there's all kinds of things we believe in. I'm going to get into some more of that as time goes on. I'm not going to bore you with all that right now. But here's the thing. I don't think that there's an easy, simple definition to what is a sin. I've heard a lot of really good ones, and there's some that are kind of known. Dictionaries and other kind of like, if you have to put it down into one thing, there's a simple definition, which is basically a transgression of a law of God. Open up your Merriam-Webster, that's what you're going to see. A transgression of a law of God. I thought about that and I said, I don't know if that really covers it. Because when we think of laws, and I know you all do this, so you don't need to sort of debate with me, this is the truth. If there is any kind of rule, for those of you who are in here for the first time, having just graduated to the youth group, we like to use driving quite often, but you could use any rule that you are given. But in driving, there's a rule that says that the maximum speed on the road is a certain speed. Out here on North Frontage Road, it's 45 miles an hour. The question is, and I know that at least one of us in the room gets the question all the time, how far over can I go before you're actually going to pull me over and write the ticket? If you're a kid, a simple rule. I need you to stay in that chair. If you ever tell a child to stay in a specific chair, you've probably experienced this. It works well for about 30 or 40 seconds. After that, they will find every corner of the chair. Are they still sitting in the chair if they're on their knees facing the other way? Are they still sitting in the chair if they are standing on the chair with one leg out going like this? Because after all, they're still in the chair. I was thinking about this. I'm like, where do you start to explain sin? And I'm like, okay, Adam and Eve. Of course, we all understand the origin of sin, right? If you've been in the church for any length of time, you're like, Adam and Eve, that's old hat. I know the story. I can read it to you. I can tell you it. We would have it down. It would be no problem. But guess what? We're going to talk about Adam and Eve. Genesis chapter 3, verses 1 through 7. That's as far as we're going to go, but there's all kinds of wonderful information just in that little bit. Now the serpent was more crafty than any of the wild animals the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, "Did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden?" The woman said to the serpent, "We may eat fruit from the trees in the garden, but God did say, you must not eat fruit from the tree that is in the middle of the garden, and you must not touch it, or you will die." "You will not certainly die," the serpent said to the woman, "for God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." When the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eye, and also desirable for gaining wisdom, she took some and ate it. She also gave some to her husband, who was with her the whole time, saying nothing. And he ate it. Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and all of a sudden they said, "Oh my goodness, we're naked!" So they went and found some fig leaves, sewed them together, and covered themselves up. Probably not very well, but that's beside the point. Heard that story before ever? I want to take you back to the beginning of the book of Genesis, a couple chapters before this happened, and there's something I really want you to understand. When you begin to read the book of Genesis and you have the formation sort of things, you have in the beginning that God created, and he uses words and he separates, but it starts off with the world was void and formless and empty. So in the beginning, God tames chaos. Formless is chaos. If you want to know what chaos looks like, let me know. I'll call you the next time it's happening at my house. But it's very formless. There's not a schedule to be followed, right? When there's not a plan in place. It's what Vicky gets so worried about when I make the joke that we're going to be here all day, when she has a plan for the children for a certain length of time. It's why she tells me, I think I can handle an extra 20 or 30 minutes overtime, but after that we're coming back. So far she's never had to do that. But that is what formless, this idea of empty and void, there's nothing really there except that it's kind of all there. You ever put together some IKEA furniture? You bring home the box, you open it up, it's formless and void. Hopefully you get the instructions and can follow along with the little stick figures doing the next thing. And eventually you have the form, and then what do you have to do? You fill it. And usually some other part of chaos goes away. This is what God does in the beginning. He basically says, I'm going to create all of this matter, this void and emptiness, and I'm going to create a form. So he begins to make sense of it all, right? Light from darkness, water from land. You see that. And then what does he do? He starts filling it up with animals and birds, and ultimately he finally gets to people. Now, there's something that God does in chapter 1, and it happens several times in chapter 1. It says it's the end of the day, and God said that it was good. He did this, and then God said it was good. And so part of that being good doesn't just simply mean good like, hey, that ice cream I had last night was good. Part of it is that it is perfect. It's exactly what's needed to be made in order for us to survive, for mankind to be in the most perfect, idealistic place for us to be. You're following where I'm going with this, right? It's the perfect, most wonderful place. And Adam and Eve were created for blessing. And now imagine if you create the most perfect environment and then you create something that's to inhabit it, that you want to see, enjoy it. And in this particular case, God wants to go even further and say, I'm going to enjoy it with you. God says something quite specific. He says, you may have any tree in the garden you may eat from. Just don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Any tree that produces fruit you can have, but don't eat from that one tree. You can eat the fruit of anything, but if you eat that one, bad things will happen. It'll be the death. You get this idea that he can eat anything he wants. He's got all of this available to him. And God sort of has this image, and I don't know, I've told you about my imagination. Most of you keep coming even though you've been warned, and that's on you. But I kind of have this vision of God just sort of bringing things in front of poor Adam, who's supposed to be naming things, right? I'm not exactly sure how Adam came up with some of these things, and, God going, what do you think you should call that? Elephant. Okay. It's an elephant. What kind of bird is this? Pigeon. Check out this fish. Catfish. This thing is pretty good size. You could probably ride it. It's got a tail and this mane and whatever else. Horse. A couple things I'm not really sure about. I don't think God is ever careless, but it's possible he dropped something. Adam said, duck! You were warned. That's a really funny looking thing. What does it do? It eats ants. Okay, anteater. And God says, whatever. Whatever you want. I created it. You call it whatever you want to call it. And that's the name that will stick. Think about this for a minute. Think about how perfect this is. God with Adam going, all right, what do you want to call this one? And I can almost see God as Adam looks and goes, well, that's a really cool thing. Or that one's maybe a little funny looking. Or that one, whatever. I can almost see God taking pleasure and going, this is so much fun. I could do this through all eternity. I might have to create some new things just to come see if he can name them. We're running out of stuff. You got the picture. Of course, God decides Adam needs a helpmate. The helpmate becomes Eve. Adam and Eve enjoyed the absence of chaos. You see, God created this most wonderful, tranquil, perfect, good place. A place where everything had its role, where everything was exactly the way it was supposed to be. And I thought about this. They didn't even have to figure out what to wear in the garden. I don't know about you, but one of the things I have to be careful about every single Sunday is make sure I don't wear the same shirt. Few of you notice. Sometimes you'll catch me on Sunday morning on YouTube going, what did I wear last week? Before that, I could just go, what? You're crazy. I didn't wear this shirt last week. Didn't even have to worry about it. Things get a little tricky when the serpent appears. I'm not exactly sure. The serpent doesn't seem to have a name. You don't get the necessarily impression that God has brought this serpent to Adam and the serpent has been named something. Serpent is more of a type of animal. You know, we kind of get the idea that it's a snake, and a snake is part of the serpent family, but not necessarily. But we're told that the serpent is more crafty. He's shrewd is the word used sort of in the Hebrew there. Kind of a cleverness about him. And so you have this one creature that things begin to get a little tricky because he's working on something. This is that one kid in my house, I won't tell you which one. But really thinking about something. And when it finally happens, you may not like exactly what you see. Now, I want to be really careful. We can't get caught up in what or who the serpent is. Is it a snake? Maybe. Does it matter? Is it Satan? Maybe. Does it matter? The narrative doesn't really say Satan went into the serpent and the serpent was a snake and it was a particular kind of snake and he went into the snake and began to use this snake like kind of taking over it. I don't want us to get too caught up in that. Just understand that there's this clever creature talking about some things to kind of cause an issue. One of the things that happens is that the language for God changes when we get to this story. If you go back and you read through chapter 2, and you are looking through chapter 2, you're going to find that every time you have Lord or God, it's not one or the other, but it's both. And in the first part of what we read today, you'll notice that it's both. It's Lord God. But when they begin to have their conversation, Lord gets dropped and it becomes just God. Think about that for a second. Language matters. Second thing is that God's words are distorted. What did God actually say? God said, you may have from any of the trees in the garden, but please don't eat from this one. What did the serpent come and say? Did God really say you can't have any of this? He reverses what God has promised. Instead of having this incredible blessing, like, you know what, there's this entire buffet, and you can have anything you want, and by the way, it's unlimited and always fresh. But stay away from the meatloaf, it's not very good. It's sort of what God did, right? You can have anything. Just stay away from this one thing because that's not going to be very good for you. But the serpent reverses it and says, did God really tell you that you must not eat from any tree in the garden? Eve adds to God's words. She corrects the serpent and says, oh, no. He said that we could eat from any tree of the garden, but he told us not to eat from the one tree. Oh, and just to make this more valuable, I guess he also said, don't touch it. God never said that. But she adds it for some reason. I think there's a warning sign there, isn't there? I mean, if we have to twist God's words or we have to add to them, we got to be careful. Sin is coming close. Serpent decides, by the way, since we're talking about what God said, did you know that God's a liar? God might have told you that you would die. You certainly won't die. You imagine being Eve, with Adam standing quietly aside. What do you do with that? Then the serpent questions God's motive. The serpent now has said, what, God is restricting you? That's sort of that hook question. And then he says, oh, well, God lied to you. If you actually did eat of the tree, you're not going to die. I promise you that. Not only that God has an ulterior motive about this. And here it is. You will become just like God. Now, the text doesn't say what that means, but if we're questioning God's motives, we must be worried that God is afraid of whatever we might find out once we eat of the tree of knowledge. Like maybe we'll know that God is just a fraud. Maybe God is worried that we would become so much like him that we would take over. Maybe God just likes the power he has of being God, and if we become like him, so now God's motive is getting questioned. Eve ends up seeing the fruit as sort of like she's seeing it for the first time. I think this is really important. I might be reading too much into this. I'm not, but I might be. Could you imagine that you can eat from any tree, but you've been told to stay away from one tree? I sometimes wonder if when Eve says, you're not supposed to even touch that tree, if that was sort of her internal sort of, look, if I don't touch the tree, I'll never be tempted to get into trouble. God will always be where God is supposed to be. I will always be where I'm supposed to be, and all will be perfect. But all of a sudden, now that she has doubt in her mind, it's as though she sees the fruit for the very first time, and she says, check it out. Looks like it's really good for food. Might be kind of tasty. And you know what? It's obviously very valuable for wisdom, because that's what this serpent said. And we always will want to believe a serpent. It's like before this that she never even thought about the benefits of eating the tree until the seeds of doubt are getting planted within her, and now all of a sudden she can't be without. Look at how good it looks. It looks delicious. Maybe it was nice and big and juicy, and maybe she reached over and touched it and said, ooh, that looks like it's going to be a good texture. Based on what the serpent said, this is the key to happiness in the place which is perfect. And you might notice in the story, it never says that Adam and Eve were unhappy. Ever. Until he sees the seeds of doubt. Got to be really clear here. Adam and Eve willingly eat. I think all of us would like to go back and say, stop. You see that serpent over there? Don't listen to him. He's an idiot. He thinks he's so smart, but he's actually just very crafty. And I know you don't normally have to deal with this, but here's the deal. He's lying to you. He's trying to put a wedge between you and your Maker. He's trying to make a difference where you cannot be with God the way you want to be. And again, sometimes we have this vision, I think it was the one that I used to have, where Eve goes and eats of the apple and then goes and says, hey, Adam, check it out. I've been munching on this wonderful thing, and here you go. Try a bite. And he goes, okay, where'd you get it? The scripture's kind of clear. He was standing there. Chaos returns to the garden when the couple feels shame. You hear what I'm saying? Perfect, tranquil. Take whatever vacation you've ever been on. Imagine it as if there were no such thing as bills. You didn't have to pay for it. It was all expenses paid. There were no expenses. You could be there as long as you want. That would be forever for most of us at our favorite vacation spot, or go to a little different part of it, whatever. Absolutely tranquil. And now, because they've eaten of the one tree and they know they've done wrong, it's back to chaos. Back to chaos. Shame is something we don't talk a lot about, and sometimes when we do, it's always in the most negative manner, but basically, it's been said that if you are unaffected by shame, do you know how this ends? If you are unaffected by shame, then you're psychotic. Because you feel no guilt. You see, we've all done things wrong. Not even necessarily on purpose. Ever accidentally cut somebody off in traffic? Ever be holding somebody's item and drop it accidentally? Have you ever been entrusted with a relationship and you've said something you shouldn't say and then you feel guilty later? If you're unaffected by shame, it's crazy. Adam and Eve sort of get the wisdom that they're seeking, but at this moment they realize that the wisdom they got was a lie. I think that very moment they realize that they've got guilt now, that there's shame in their life, that they need to cover up because they're naked. That's what, now that I know I should listen to God. You know, the problem is we repeat this every single day of our lives. Well, we don't necessarily repeat it every single day. We go through the same sort of thing where the serpent is yakking in our ear. Wouldn't this be fun? Is God really real? Should you really be paying attention to God? Should you really be doing this? Should you really be doing that? I mean, come on. This is kind of an interesting factoid. This is trivia that you can do with as you please. But there's a very small difference between the words shrewd and naked in Hebrew. So the writer kind of gives us this little thing. He uses the word shrewd. It's one letter difference. One little letter. Take one letter out and you have naked. So what they were trying to do was become shrewd like the serpent. Or like they maybe had sensed that God was. What they ended up with was nakedness and shame. This entire event is really kind of tangled up, isn't it? You start to think about all the deception, all the little half-truths that are in it, and you begin to realize what the problem is. But I have a little different concern for us as we get this kicked off. What is the biggest danger in our doctrine of sin? What's the biggest danger? I think one of our biggest challenges is that there is danger when we are too comfortable with the story. There might be a few of you that were like, okay, I only heard this once in my life. What? It's all about Adam and Eve? And if you're one of those people, that's cool. It really is. But I think for some of us, I kind of grew up in the church, so I kind of have known this like as long as I can remember. And I've kind of heard this story so many times and not really exactly sure what teaching went on around it, but I'm so comfortable with this story that if I were to start reading Genesis tomorrow, I'd be flipping pages pretty quick. Not much to see here. I've got a good doctrine of sin. How much thought did you actually put into the fact that the serpent was speaking? I see on the next door Foothills Yuma site all the time where somebody found a snake in their backyard or in their garage or in their pool. Never once did I hear them say, I asked that thing to leave. And it said, nope, this pool is quite comfortable, thank you. If you want me gone, you got to call the cops. No. Usually they don't say this, but I know what happened. They went, ah! Back into the house. We can't go out there until somebody's come and gotten rid of that thing. Yet Eve seems to think it's completely normal. The story doesn't say that the serpent began to talk to Eve, and Eve went, oh my goodness, it's a talking snake! Apparently there was no background music to tell her that danger was coming like there would be in a movie. I so wish that that background music was a real thing in real life. Oh, watch out, something's happening. Look out, because that serpent's going to start talking. When it talks, it's a liar. No, we read right through it. The serpent talked. Did the elephants talk too? Monkeys, gorillas, lions, kitty cats, dogs? I'd love to have a conversation with my dog every so often. Why'd you do that on the floor? I have that side of it. He looks up and goes, tail wagging away. It was fun. Had a grand old time. Love to actually know what's going on in his brain. The story is so familiar to most Christians that I don't think we stop and go, well, what does this mean to us? In fact, if anything, I think we have the opposite effect. We're like, oh, so this is all of our problems. Adam and Eve, you two unshrewd people. Couldn't you have been a little more clever? What do we actually think about what had happened? What do we do with this story, knowing the story a little better? If we stop and we think about the story, what are we going to do with it? Because I tell you, there's all kinds of wonderful ways to get out of sin. Like, don't listen to the half-lies that the Satan or the serpent is trying to tell you. Don't listen to when the serpent comes and takes what God says and kind of twists it around, kind of opens yourself a little bit to it. You see, when we get comfortable, we lower our defenses. If we think that there's something bad about to happen, if the music started to play, our defenses would go up and we start to look around. But most of the time, the soundtrack doesn't play in real life, and so we don't see the bad thing that's coming. And partly because sometimes we weren't even paying attention to things we probably should have been looking at. We believe everything is normal. We put our attention elsewhere. Put normal in quotes because I don't know what that is. But there's a sense that there are times when something is normal. In chaos, we should be watching for danger. And if you didn't catch on yet, Adam and Eve's decision brought us back into chaos. Jesus wants to overcome that. Good news. Are you so comfortable with the story of Adam and Eve and the deception into sin that your defenses are down? Something you need to do there? Secondly, I'd like to mention that there's danger when we are too unfamiliar with the doctrine. Now, I don't think that you need to know doctrine just for doctrine's sake, but what exactly is sin? I know, I didn't give you that answer. Come back next week. Same time, same channel. I'll tell you what. If it's okay with Gretchen, we won't charge any admission fee next week. If you were here today, you can come in, you don't need a ticket. She said yes. If we haven't really thought about what we believe about sin, how do we recognize it when we see it? You see, this is where we start to get into a problem. Is it when I think that I have a bad thought? Or is it just when I have an action? When do I actually start to get into that? You see, Adam and Eve had one restriction, but they allowed a serpent to put it in question. So if we have a good idea of sin and how this whole thing comes about, there's a little story there for us, isn't there? Like maybe we should be really careful about allowing that doubt to come in. Really, really careful. It seems to me like they weren't thinking about the end result, which is what was going to happen when God figured it out. Sometimes we think about that, we still do the sin, but that's a different story altogether. Doctrine's important, especially when we're willing to protect what we believe. And let me tell you, you will protect what you believe about the doctrine of sin. If you think that something is a sin and you're going to do everything you can to keep it from happening because you want to please God, you will do everything you can. You'll make sure your guard is up whenever something like that comes around. Promise you that. Are you guarding against sin because of your familiarity with this doctrine? Or do you just not give it any thought at all? There's also danger when we are too comfortable with sin itself. To be honest with you, I think that's how we get to where there can be pretty much universal understanding that adultery is sin. It's almost always wrong. But then not be so sure about gossip. Because gossip probably isn't all that bad, right? Does it really rise to the level of sin? We're pretty comfortable with gossip. Unless it's about us. Then we have kind of an issue with it. Are we careful about that? You see, Eve said, look, it looks good. It looks valuable. Going to give us the wisdom we want. The idea was there. She just went with it. When we know what we are supposed to do or what we are not supposed to do, how comfortable are we to go the next step? How comfortable are we? Are we comfortable with doing the sin-filled thing? Or are we thinking as hard as we can that we need to avoid it at all costs? Worry that we as a church don't talk about this kind of stuff too much. And as a result, we end up tricked by sin. I don't think anybody purposely goes in and says, you know what? X is a sin, and I'm going to do everything I can to do X because it seems fun. I just don't believe that. I believe that we think God doesn't want us to do that, and then we get these little doubts and go, well, maybe just this one. Maybe if we don't get caught. Maybe if this. Maybe if that. What if we try to do it this way? What if we go around and whatever else? And I think in the end, we end up just getting drawn into what we're giving our energy to. We've got to have a good idea of what sin is. Would you agree? Had me worried there for a minute. Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for the privilege it is to be in your house, the privilege it is that you say that whatever is yours, we can be blessed by. That when we look around and we see what you have created, you give it to us without exception. When we look around and we see what you have provided for us, help us to be faithful to what you've called us to do. Where you've said all of this is good, all of this is worthy, but stay away from these few things. Don't be an adulterer. Don't kill other people. Don't do all of these various things. But most importantly, we recognize that it's sin when we don't love you the way you've asked us to love you. Help us to not be caught up by a crafty and clever serpent who's constantly trying to tear us away from you and get us apart from you, who tells us half-truths, things that sound good, things that sound like maybe we'd misunderstood what you said, but simply take us away from what you want for us. Lord, be with us throughout this week. Guide us, direct us, keep us safe until we have the opportunity to worship you together once again. The most wonderful and most powerful name that we know, in the name of Jesus, all God's people said,